Hey guys, today I want to talk about and compare three very similar training longswords. To give you a little backstory, when I started doing HEMA longsword training, the club that I currently attend has a bunch of the Angus Trim I-Beams. I started training with those and eventually I wanted to get my own. But the thing is, Angus Trim no longer makes the I-Beam. He's basically retired from sword making, though he does occasionally produce pieces in his spare time and put them up for sale. He typically does knives now, I believe. So I was looking around for where you could get an I-Beam, and the Angus Trim ones you can really only find if somebody sells theirs on eBay or if somebody, basically puts it up for sale, which is fairly rare these days. So I found one on Valiant Armoury because they produce a copy. Valiant Armoury makes it basically without Angus Trim's input. I actually asked Angus Trim a few questions about the Valiant Armoury I-Beam, and he specifically stated that he has no input on that product. He basically just licensed it to them, and that's the end of it. So let's go on with the comparisons here. Now there are two different versions of the Angus Trim I-Beam that we have in the class, and this is one of them. Now on this one, you'll notice that the crossguard is pretty much uniform, just a very simple straight bar. The pommel is somewhat ornate, it has just this rising bit here in the middle, and the width of the blade is actually pretty wide on this model. You'll see on the other ones it's much thinner in this dimension here that I'm holding with my finger. And this one, the distal tapering, is actually pretty decent. Now I went ahead and I measured this sword and the other two with digital calipers and a tape measure just to see what their sizes are. So this one, I'm calling this the Angus Trim I-Beam A, because I think this is an earlier Angus Trim I-Beam. This is purely speculation. I'll get into it more when I talk about the other ones, but I'm calling this the early one because it seems to have a very wide blade that seems to have gotten thinner in the later models. And you'll notice this fuller here, this dark fuller, runs all the way to the tip of the I-Beam. So this one is, let me look at my measurement card here. This one has a 35-inch long blade, and from the crossguard here to the pommel is 11 inches. The distal taper, starting here at the crossguard, is 6 millimeters. In the middle, it goes down to about 5 millimeters in the middle, and then the tip is right about 2.75 millimeters, just under 3 millimeters, basically. I'm sorry that I'm doing half of this in inches and half of this in millimeters, but you can do the conversion if you need. So that's basically this one. And again, this is what I'm calling the A model because I think it's an earlier Angus Trim I-Beam. The next I-Beam that we have a few of is this one. You'll notice that the pommel now is a little more simple. It is concave, so it's got kind of a hollow, like a hollowed out bowl kind of shape here. The crossguard, instead of being a straight, very simple straight guard, now has kind of a flare here. It kind of gets wider towards the end of the quillins. It is thinner in this dimension along, and you'll see that the fuller stops quite a bit further away from the tip than the other version I was looking at. This one has what I call the B version, because I think this is a later version. The distal taper on this one is actually very similar to the A version. It starts at 6 millimeters. Around the middle of the blade is just around 5 millimeters, and then the tip, I believe this one's tip is actually a bit smaller. It's around 2.75, or it's actually about the same, yeah, 2.75 millimeters, almost 3 millimeters basically, just under 3 millimeters at the tip. The length of the blade is still 35 inches, and from the crossguard to the bottom of the pommel is still 11 inches. So dimensions wise, this is very similar. It's just that this one I'll try to get these both on camera here without breaking something. The A version has a much wider blade, a more simple, a simpler crossguard, a different pommel, and the fuller, where the fuller stops on these swords is slightly different. So those are the main differences between what I'm calling the A version and what I'm calling the B version, basically. Now, I think that this is a later model, the B version, that is, I think is a later model of Angus Trim's I-Beam, and I think that because when I look at the Valiant I-Beam, the Valiant Armoury I-Beam, it looks like this is the one that they've patterned theirs off of the most. You'll see that the crossguard is very similar, the length of the fuller is very similar. It's just overall much more similar to this one than it is to the A, or what I think is the early version. Which of the two Angus Trim I-Beams is actually earlier and which one came later is, I'm just sort of speculating about at this point. I could be wrong. Valiant, this may be the earlier one, and Valiant based theirs off of this, but I need to research that more, basically. So, moving on to the Valiant Armoury one. So this is basically the standard. I didn't have much custom done on this. The only thing I got was, I chose the grip color, which is brown. By default, I think it comes with black, but you can get any grip color for no extra price, which is pretty great. You'll see that the quillin has that same flaring at the end. A pretty typical crossguard, honestly. But it doesn't seem to be copying that other version of the I-Beam with the very straight, simple crossguard. This one has a riser in the middle, which I like. The Angus Trim I-Beams don't have that. Pommel's fairly simple. You'll see it still has a fuller here that runs, again, much like what I'm calling the B version. It runs kind of until about 7 inches away or so from the tip of the blade. Now, one of the reasons I'm doing this comparison is that when I went to get a training sword, I wanted something like the Angus Trim I-Beams we had in class, and the Valiant I-Beam was the closest thing I could find. When I started using this sword, I started to notice that it's much heavier than the Angus Trim ones. And I started to try to figure out why that is, basically. Why is this sword so much heavier? So the dimensions on this, let's go over the dimensions real quick to compare to those. Now you remember these guys, the two Angus Trim ones, they have 35-inch long blades, 11-inch long hilts. They have a distal taper that starts at 6 millimeters and goes to about 3 millimeters at the tip. This sword is a little bit different. The hilt is still 11 inches from the crossguard to the end of the pommel. However, the blade is half an inch longer. This is a 35.5-inch blade. So it's got it's slightly longer, ever so slightly, just half an inch longer than the Angus Trim I-Beams. The distal taper is where there's actually a big difference. The distal taper on this one starts off at 7 millimeters, whereas these are 6 millimeters. So it's a full millimeter thicker at the crossguard. In the middle, where the other ones are about 5 millimeters in the middle this one's about 5.25, 5.25 millimeters. And at the tip of the Valiant Armoury I-Beam is right about, just looking at my measurements to check here, yeah, right about 4 millimeters. I took measurements in a few places with the calipers, and some places got right on 4 millimeters, some were slightly less. But either way, this has a thicker tip overall than the Angus Trim I-Beams. So, a few differences there, but it doesn't seem like that would account for so much extra weight. And I was looking at all three swords last night trying to figure out what it is that makes this one so much heavier. And I think what it is the depth of the fuller. The fuller on the Valiant I-Beam doesn't feel nearly as deep as on the Angus Trim versions. When I put my fingers on either side of the quillin, and I'm not a digital caliper, but it feels like there's quite a bit of thickness there. It seems like it's mostly an aesthetic fuller. It doesn't seem to be actually reducing any weight or creating any strength. Whereas when I pick up especially the version B, what I think is the later version, when I put my fingers on either side of the fuller, it feels much, much thinner. I mean, it just seems like they took out more material with the fuller in the Angus Trim versions of these I-Beams. So, that is basically the overview for these swords. In terms of handling, I tend to like the version B, basically, of the Angus Trim I-Beam. It's got the thinner blade in this dimension. It handles very nicely. It doesn't feel whippy at all. It feels, you know, very much like a sword. And it's great for sparring, it's great for drilling. It's just an overall good, blunt, longsword trainer. Now, sadly, as I said, Angus Trim is kind of, he's basically retired from sword making, though he does do the occasional rare piece. So you can't really get Angus Trim I-Beams anywhere anymore, except for, you know, via second hand and such. So while I like this one the best, sadly it's just, you know, it's basically impossible to find these anymore, which is kind of sad, because I think they're really well balanced, they're really well made. Going over the construction a little bit, just for comparison, and these two have very similar, the two Angus Trim ones have very similar hilts. They have steel fittings, so the crossguards and pommels are steel. The hilt itself is interesting. I'm going to try to get this close to the camera so you can take a look. It seems to be some sort of cord, basically, coated in either a lacquer or an adhesive of some sort. And the thing is, when these swords get loose, and sometimes they do, you can tighten it down with just, you know, a typical Allen wrench. I actually did that before I did the review because this one was a little loose. But when the handle comes loose, it feels like it's all one piece, just one solid chunk of handle. So I'm not quite sure as to how this was constructed. I'd have to get in touch with Angus Trim, I suppose, and see. But it appears to be cord wrapped and then covered in some sort of very rigid, very durable lacquer or adhesive, because it feels like one solid piece, and it's a good grip. It doesn't shift around as long as the pommel isn't loose. It doesn't shift around. It just gives you a very positive surface for handling this sword. The handle on the A version is, again, it's pretty much identical. It's the same lacquer / adhesive covering the cord. I'd really like to know more about how this is constructed, because it's a really nice design. I like it. It's nothing that I would want on a personal, you know, a decorative sword or a, how to put this, a high quality custom, for example. But for a training sword, this is amazing. I mean, it's durable, it gives you a good grip, everything. Like, it's what you want in a training sword, for sure. The grip on the Valiant Armoury one is leather, and there is cord under this, so it's a much more traditional grip, basically, with a cord-wrapped leather handle with a riser and everything. The handle feels really nice. Gripping in the hand and everything feels good. Sometimes the pommel comes loose, which is exactly like the Angus Trim ones. Supposedly and technically that's by design, so that when it comes loose, you have distance to keep tightening it and keep the sword functional, as it were. But yeah, it feels really great. You'll notice mine has taken quite a beating, but that's because I've had this for months, and I do all my longsword training with this. I typically spar with a feeder or a fetter. However, this is what I do all my drilling with. This is what I do all of my my forms and everything with, cutting practice and stuff. It is extra heavy, like I said, and I think when I weigh these on a scale, this was a full, it was almost a full pound heavier, however many ounces that is. I'm not really good with that, but it was quite a few more ounces heavier than the Angus Trim versions. So I've taken to calling this basically my weight training blade. It's a strength conditioning blade, as it were, because it's that extra weight makes it so that, you know, I have to work a little harder when I do my drills, when I'm practicing my cutting and everything. And then when I switch over to my feeder or one of the Angus Trims, it just feels amazing. I mean, it's just so much lighter that that's the one, you know, good thing I'd say about this one is that when you switch to another sword, it's so much lighter after using this one. And this one isn't terribly balanced or anything, it's just that it's heavier. It's just heavier. That's really all I can, you know, say about it. Point of balance on these, so it's about 4 to 5 inches away from the crossguard here. See if we can get it right on there. Yeah. So it's a reasonable distance away. It's got a lot of blade presence because again the blade is just so heavy that it, you know, it definitely feels, you know, like a good solid blade coming at you. And so from that perspective it's really good. This has held up wonderfully, by the way, to a lot of contact. If you look at the edges here, you'll see, you know, lots and lots of pitting and stuff that I really need to file out, and this sword needs some tender loving care basically. The back is not so much because I usually swing from the same side, keep the sword oriented in the same direction when I use it. But yeah, this has held up to a lot of abuse. It is definitely, you know, very heavy duty. It's just that it's heavier. So if you're looking to get one of these, know that it's going to be a little heavier than you might like, but there are some advantages to that because you'll basically get strength training when using this sword. So I like it. I like the fact that you can get a custom grip color. I like the look overall. I like the feel. I just think the weight needs fine tuning. And to that end, I actually have a new pommel on the way because I basically asked the Valiant Armoury guy, Sonny, if I could get a heavier pommel to try to balance this out a little bit. And we'll see if that makes any difference. I'll post an update, but I honestly think it'll add more weight to the back, which may help the balance, but it'll still be a heavy sword. And again, what I'm thinking that is from is because the fuller is not cut as deep. So really, if you moved, if you could remove overall a millimeter of metal from this whole blade and make the fuller deeper, a deeper cut fuller, this thing would be on par with the Angus Trim I-Beams for weight and balance and everything. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the Valiant Armoury I-Beam. Heavier than the original that it's based off of, and could use some improvement, but otherwise looks and feels really good. Anything extra to say about these swords? With all of these, keep in mind that you should always have, a trusty standard Allen wrench, which I have now lost. Second thing, don't lose your, there it is. Just a standard Allen wrench for all three of these. They will come loose during normal sparring and everything. That's how they're designed. You can get these. You can get the Valiant Armoury one with a hot peened tip, but I went with the hex specifically because when it gets loose during training, I wanted to be able to tighten up myself and make any modifications that I needed. So hot peening is there if you want it, but the hex nut is both cheaper and I think it's a bit more functional. And the other two I-Beams, the originals that they're based off of, use the exact same hex nut. On this one we actually replaced that hex nut with a brass nut because the original hex nut just got stripped, so we just took it out, put this one in. I have to ask my instructor where he got these, but they're a nice functional washer. They fit nicely and they don't seem to strip as terribly, so it's pretty good. Yes. Anything else to say about these swords? That pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about with these three. If you can find an Angus Trim I-Beam anywhere, jump on it. Do jump on it. They are very nicely balanced. They're excellent training weapons. I should actually show you the edges real quick, just to show you that. And I think I did already show them, but they are quite safe. They are thick enough for sparring and everything. This is the B version. All three of them are quite thick enough for contact and sparring and everything. I've used the Valiant I-Beam against the Angus Trim I-Beam, and they, you know, the amount of damage they take is consistent. There's no extra damage given to either one. The only time I don't like to use the heavier Valiant I-Beam is when I'm fighting against a thinner blade, such as a feeder. The feeder blades tend to be much more narrow, and I worry about this one just putting too much of a hurting on a feeder. The Angus Trim I-Beams, it feels like they're so much lighter that you can actually go against a feeder without doing it too much damage. So again, my preference is the Angus Trim I-Beam, but you can't buy them anywhere. You simply cannot find them. So if you're looking for a new I-Beam, the way to go is Valiant. And if you do get in touch with Valiant Armoury, you can get a lot of custom stuff done to your I-Beam if you want. Like I already mentioned, the grip color is free, but you can also change up the pommel, and you'll just have to pay basically whatever the difference is for the pommel. And my brother actually ordered one of these, and he actually specified how he wanted the blade to be tapered. And he said I'd have to ask him again, but I believe he wanted it to start at a 6mm thickness at the crossguard and go to a 2mm thickness at the end. I've seen pictures of his finished sword, but I have not been able to measure it. So I'm wondering if they actually, if they delivered on that, or if they just said, yeah, okay, and then sent him a standard blade. Because honestly, his measurements were actually very close to what the real measurements are. So I'm not sure if they actually made any changes to it. I'd honestly have to take a look. Yeah. But Sonny with Valiant Armoury is a very helpful guy. If you have any questions, if you want anything custom done, he will do it. I'm waiting on the pommel for that to see if it'll balance out the weight a little bit. But Sonny's very accommodating. He can help you out. Valiant Armoury is a pretty cool company. I will link to Valiant Armoury down below, and I'll try to get a link to Angus Trim's page as well, in the interest of fairness. But I'm pretty sure the last time I checked for his site, it was either down or just didn't have anything on it. But I'll try to find something to link down below. So yes, there it is. That's the Valiant Armoury I-Beam and 2 Angus Trim I-Beams of slightly different design. And thank you for watching.